Tuesday, June 30. Welcome to CGN News. Some U.S. visitors to Jamaica must be pre-tested for COVID-19 effective July 1. Visitors from Florida, New York, Arizona, and Texas in the United States will have to be pre-tested for COVID-19 for their applications for landing to be considered. Visitors with travel dates after July 10 will have to comply. Prime Minister Andrew Holness made the announcement from Jamaica House yesterday evening as the government continues to reconfigure protocols for entry and re-entry to the island in its push to fully reopen the country in spite of the pandemic. The prerequisite for entry applies to individuals coming from COVID-19 hotspots. With a number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Guyana now at 235, of which 109 are active, the Ministry of Public Health has reprimanded the attitude of the Guyanese public. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Shamdeo Prasad sternly reprimanded the actions of citizens in certain sections of the population for disregarding COVID-19 measures and advisories which were implemented to prevent the spread of the virus. Dr. Prasad noted that despite repeated warnings to observe physical distancing, to wear a mask when out in public, and to adhere to the curfew measures, the messages were falling on deaf ears with the young population, determined to do as they please. Bermuda will introduce a strict COVID-19 testing regime when it opens its borders tomorrow, Wednesday, to international flights for the first time in more than 3 months. The fourth and final phase of the easing of restrictions introduced in March to cope with the coronavirus pandemic will kick in at 6 a.m. local time on July 1, but a curfew will remain, although the hours will change from midnight to 5 a.m. The curfew will be reviewed on a weekly basis afterwards. Premier David Burt, who is keen to belatedly kickstart the island's summer tourism season, has praised local efforts to fight the coronavirus and said there had been a lot of work getting Bermuda to this point. Coronavirus has claimed 9 lives among 146 confirmed cases on the island. Allegations of mass vote tampering in Guyana may lead to the country's discredited government being ostracized unless a court hearing next week can resolve a bitter dispute over election results. The political stakes in Guyana have risen massively since May 2015, when ExxonMobil discovered oil reserves potentially worth more than $100 billion off the coast, a find big enough to transform a South American country of fewer than 1 million people with a GDP of $3 billion, largely based on sugar, timber, molasses, and bauxite. In a court-enforced and delayed regional and general election on March 2, the ruling president, David Granger, claimed victory and control of the assembly, but was then forced to hold a national recount since it was evident a massive voter fraud had been perpetrated. A recount found the opposition party had won the most votes. A court hearing next Wednesday, due to be held at Guyana's highest court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, has been called to settle the issue finally, more than 3 months after the Guyanese went to the polls. But there are signs that Granger will not recognize the court's jurisdiction, placing the international community in a dilemma. The final election outcome will have a big impact on Guyana's future relationship with the oil industry. Many observers claim Exxon's current license to extract oil needs renegotiating. Others say Guyana is on the edge of a bonanza and will become the richest oil country on earth as measured by income per capita. Overseas now, the British government on Monday ordered schools and non-essential shops in the central city of Leicester to close after a localized outbreak of coronavirus. Health Secretary Matt Hancock said nationwide moves to ease a 3-month lockdown would be reversed in Leicester, where the infection rate is 3 times as high as the next worst affected city. Schools, which only reopened for some children on June 1, would close from Thursday, and shops that only opened 2 weeks ago would be shuttered from Tuesday. Plans to reopen pubs, restaurants, and cultural sites on July 4 would be scrapped in Leicester, although they would go ahead elsewhere in England, and locals are now being advised against all but essential travel. Leicester, a city of around 340,000 people, has recorded 866 new cases of coronavirus in the past 2 weeks, a total of 3,000 since the outbreak began in March, local authorities say. Leicester's elected mayor, Peter Soulsby, had previously argued against extending the lockdown in his city, suggesting the higher numbers were in part due to higher levels of testing. Thousands of people are marching in cities and towns across Sudan, demanding greater political reforms. On the eve of the demonstrations, Sudan's civilian Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok addressed the nation and promised that key reforms would be announced in the coming days. He and other leaders are under pressure to deliver, especially as the country battles with rising food and fuel prices and a coronavirus outbreak which has killed more than 500 people and stifled economic activity. Civil society groups say the protest is intended to make sure the goals of last year's revolution, which deposed Omar al-Bashir as president, are achieved. Crowds have gathered singing and chanting, blaring car horns and carrying placards. These are scenes similar to the ones during months of protests which ended Bashir's decades-long rule and led to the formation of a joint civilian and military government. But there is growing concern that the country's hopes for political reform and true civilian rule will not be met. The EU has decided that from Wednesday, EU borders will be reopened to citizens from 50 non-EU countries, including Canada, Morocco, and Australia, but not the US, Brazil, and Russia. China is on the list, but subject to a reciprocal agreement still pending. The unanimous decision by the European Council is not legally binding, so states can choose not to open up to all those countries. EU officials say the decision was based on a number of scientific factors, including a low COVID-19 infection rate, where nations had fewer than 16 in every 100,000 infected, that there was a downward trend of cases, and lastly, that social distancing measures were at sufficient levels. Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, has ordered the European Union's ambassador to leave the country within 72 hours. Isabel Brillante Predosa's expulsion came hours after the EU placed sanctions on 11 Venezuelan officials. They were sanctioned for acting against the National Assembly headed by opposition leader Juan Guaido. Mr. Guaido declared himself interim president last year but has failed to remove Mr. Maduro. The opposition leader has the backing of the EU and the US. Earlier on Monday, the European Council said the 11 officials were added to the sanctions list because of their role in acts and decisions undermining democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela. In his announcement on Monday broadcast on state television, speaking of the EU, Mr. Maduro said, quote, "If they can't respect Venezuela, then they should leave it," end quote. That's it for your CGN News. I'm Scott Wilson. Thanks for watching.